The old courthouse files in Cumberland County hold a secret that officials hoped no one would ever uncover. Between 1832 and 1839, 7 young mothers disappeared from the same tight-knit farming community, each case ending in silence and unanswered questions. For years, it seemed like misfortune or a coincidence until the spring of 1839, when the truth began to surface. What was uncovered not only shocked the county, but hinted at a hidden system of corruption stretching from poor farms to the state's most powerful families. At the center of it all stood 2 sisters, Mercy and Charity Goodwin, whose story would forever change how people saw their community. Their case exposed not just a single man's dangerous obsession, but a dark web of influence that many believed was far larger than anyone dared admit. By the late 1830s, Cumberland County was thriving. Tobacco fields rolled across the red clay hills. Merchants passed through on the road between Fayetteville and the western frontier, and family names carried the weight of honor and reputation. Mercy and Charity were the pride of the county, identical twins with copper-bright hair and eyes that seemed to shift with the light. Their beauty and refinement drew attention everywhere they went. But their lives were turned upside down in 1837, when yellow fever claimed both parents within days. The fortune their family had carefully maintained collapsed, almost overnight debts surfacing faster than they could be paid. The land, the grand home, and even their mother's jewelry were sold, leaving the sisters stripped of security. By 1838, they lived above a general store in a narrow boarding room, with Charity teaching farm children to read, and Mercy, frail in health, struggling to find respectable work. For women of their standing, beauty, and breeding meant little without money or a man's protection. And it was during this fragile moment that Jeremiah Whitlow entered their lives. At 38, Whitlow was already a name of influence, owner of a flourishing trading company, with interests in tobacco, cotton, and the railroads that promised to reshape North Carolina's economy. He was wealthy, respected, and unmarried, presenting himself as a man who had simply been too busy for love. Though not handsome, his sharp features and piercing pale eyes put some ill at ease. He carried an air of charm and power that was difficult to resist. For Mercy and Charity, still grieving, still vulnerable, he seemed like salvation. Though Whitlow lacked conventional good looks, he carried himself with a polished grace that was hard to ignore. He dressed with impeccable taste, spoke with the crisp cadence of an educated gentleman, and radiated the calm certainty of a man who had more money than most would see in a lifetime. To the Goodwin sisters, what mattered most was that he noticed them at all, while others of his class ignored their reduced station. Whitlow seemed to take a personal interest in their well-being. His attentions, however, quickly proved to be both flattering and unsettling. He appeared at the boarding house with gifts that no ordinary suitor would have considered, bolts of imported silk perfumes worth more than a year's wages and jewelry that sparkled like captured firelight. Yet he never favored one twin over the other. His devotion was divided equally, almost unnaturally, so as if he were studying them rather than courting them. More than once he told them with a kind of fervent awe that they were perfection made manifest, his pale eyes flicking between their faces like a man caught between 2 mirrors. The sisters, flattered but uneasy, began to sense the peculiar intensity behind his words. That unease deepened when, in the spring of 1839, Whitlow proposed a marriage unlike any other. Taking both their hands, he declared he could not choose between such identical beauty. He insisted Mercy would be his lawful wife, while Charity would share his household and his heart treated as an equal in every way but under the law. Such an arrangement was not entirely unknown in rural North Carolina, where widowed sisters or cousins often joined a household for survival. But Whitlow's request carried a strange weight. For Mercy and Charity, who faced poverty and the prospect of separation, the promise of security and of staying together outweighed their doubts. What they did not see were the miniature portraits decorating Whitlow's study, each a likeness of a young woman bearing their same copper hair and moss-green eyes. What they did not question was why a wealthy man of nearly 40 had never before taken a wife. On a stifling June morning, with only a minister and 2 witnesses present, Mercy became Mrs. Whitlow. The ceremony was stripped of celebration, rushed and curiously impersonal. Whitlow speaking his vows while his gaze seemed to drift somewhere over Mercy's shoulder. Soon after, the sisters were brought to Rosemont, his grand estate. From the outside, it was everything they had been promised: a mansion of 40 rooms, built in the finest federal style with sweeping columns and wide verandas overlooking fertile fields. Inside, wealth gleamed from every surface: polished mahogany Persian rugs, soft as moss chandeliers, scattering rainbows across silk-covered walls. And yet beneath the splendor, Rosemont felt hollow. The beauty of the house seemed staged, its rooms too perfect, too untouched, as if designed not for living, but for display. For Mercy and Charity, who had lost so much, the estate seemed like salvation. They could not yet see it for what it truly was, the opening act of a nightmare. There were no family portraits or personal mementos to give the place a heartbeat, and even Whitlow's own bedroom was stripped down to bare necessities, offering no clues about the man who claimed Rosemont as his home. The household staff was small and odd: an Irish housekeeper named Mrs. Donovan, whose accent made her hard to follow, 2 quiet maids who always seemed on edge, and a groundskeeper called Samuel, who spoke mostly with nods. All of them had been hired within the last 2 years after previous employees had left, Mrs. Donovan said almost too suddenly. At first, the sisters blamed the strangeness on grief and their sudden change in fortune, but the luxury around them began to feel like a gilded cage. Whitlow watched them in a way that never felt quite right, as if he were studying specimens rather than sharing a life, and he kept them on a ritual of perfection that read like a list of rules for living. He hired a French governess to polish their manners, brought in a Charleston seamstress to build them wardrobes of impossibly fine gowns, and insisted on a daily routine meant to preserve youth and beauty, from timed walks to evening baths in milk and honey. What started as flattering attention soon felt controlling, and by autumn both sisters were pregnant. Instead of joy, their pregnancies brought a strange intensity from Whitlow and a nervous local physician named Dr. Harrison Fletcher, who seemed eager to oblige every demand. Whitlow spoke often about bloodlines and flawlessness, and Dr. Fletcher nodded and promised that everything would be managed. The sisters also began to uncover unsettling signs around the house. Mercy found a locked room on the 3rd floor that Mrs. Donovan dismissed as storage. Charity discovered gardening tools in the carriage house, crusted with something that looked like dried blood, though Samuel insisted they were for butchering animals, even though Rosemont kept no stock. Nightmares followed them, shared dreams of crying infants trapped behind walls, and women calling from deep below the house, dreams that left them clinging to each other for reassurance. They tried to shrug it off as nerves, but the feeling of being watched never left, not just by Whitlow, but by some presence in the shadows that made every corner of the mansion feel watched and waiting. The grand halls of Rosemont no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like a trap, for the echoes inside those walls betrayed hidden passages, hollow spaces where sound moved as if the house itself were listening. And slowly, unbearably, Mercy and Charity came to understand that Whitlow's fixation on their beauty had nothing to do with love. It was control obsession and something far more sinister. One frigid December night, as her pregnancy neared its final weeks, Charity's search for a book in the library uncovered the truth that had been waiting for her. She brushed her hand against the spines and felt the catch of a mechanism hidden in the shelves. A panel swung open, revealing a narrow stairwell spiraling into darkness. Against the pull of terror, she lit a candle and descended into the damp earth beneath the mansion. What she found there stole the breath from her lungs. The cellar was no storage room, but a shrine of the missing. On shelves lined with care sat the belongings of women whose names the county still whispered, a silk wedding gown, faint with lavender silver hairbrushes, etched with initials, a journal abandoned mid-sentence, a music box whose fragile tune filled the air with unbearable melancholy. 7 sets of possessions, 7 erased lives. And carved into the clay wall with nails that must have bled as they scratched were names and dates. Margaret Crawford, Sarah Henley, Rebecca Patterson, Anna Louise, Mackenzie, Catherine Vaughn, Eleanor Pierce, Helen Gardner. Year by year, a new bride, a new victim. Each vanished after bearing Whitlow's child. Charity's candle sputtered shadows, twisting across the dirt walls, and then she heard the soft tread of footsteps on the stairs. Her husband's voice calling her name with a mockery of tenderness. Charity, my perfect one. Where have you wandered off to now? She fled, heart hammering, and that night whispered her discovery to Mercy. The sisters clung to each other, terror mingling with the weight of their unborn children. They spoke of escape, of running under cover of darkness, before Whitlow could guess what Charity had uncovered. But freedom was already slipping out of reach. The very next day they realized their every step was shadowed. Samuel appeared wherever they walked, silent but ever present. Mrs. Donovan hovered with suffocating attentiveness, pressing help on them for tasks they had long done themselves. Dr. Fletcher began visiting daily, his shaking hands no comfort, as his eyes lingered too long, reporting back on more than their health. And Whitlow, he seemed to sense their fear without acknowledging it. He read to them for hours, his pale eyes darting between their faces, his words about nurseries and lullabies spoken in a voice that was both soothing and chilling. When they begged to see friends in town, to feel the world beyond Rosemont's gates, he smiled and told them it was too dangerous. They belonged at home, where he could keep them safe. And the sisters knew then, with the weight of certainty, that they were no longer wives, but prisoners. My perfect ones? Whitlow would murmur, his tone smooth, but carrying an edge sharp enough to chill the blood. You must see that your safety and the safety of our children is my highest duty. The winter roads are dangerous, and in town there are influences that might harm your delicate minds and bodies. Here at Rosemont, you are protected. Here nothing can threaten your well-being or your perfection. The sisters understood then that they were not wives, but captives, and that any rash attempt to flee would likely end in their deaths. So they began to play a longer game. They smiled, obeyed, and feigned contentment, while quietly gathering scraps of information. Charity risked returning to the hidden cellar when she could studying the relics of the women who had come before them. Margaret Crawford's journal revealed a life that mirrored their own, too closely to ignore. At first, she wrote of Jeremiah's suffocating devotion, then of her pregnancy, then of physicians who asked unsettling questions about bloodlines. By midsummer, she confessed to nightmares of crying infants and unseen women. And then the entries stopped abruptly. The silence of that unfinished diary told its own story. Mercy, meanwhile, turned her attention to the living members of the household. Dr. Fletcher always carried a heavy leather bag that rattled faintly, as though filled with instruments for more than simple medicine. Mrs. Donovan received shadowy visitors who came under cover of darkness, men who never lingered until morning. Samuel, outwardly just a mute groundskeeper, was, in truth, the estate's watchman, keeping careful record of all who traveled nearby and reporting to Whitlow. Piece by piece, the sisters mapped out their prison. Rosemont stood on acres of isolated land, with no neighbors within miles, its distance from the main road, ensuring that no passerby would glimpse the mansion's secrets. Letters never left the house. Any attempt was intercepted before reaching town. When they tried to bribe one of the maids to deliver a message, the girl dissolved into terrified tears, refusing to cross Whitlow. Even small attempts at escape failed, as every path was blocked. Money withheld, clothes and coats restricted, access to horses denied. What had seemed like luxury was now clear. It was a cage padded in silk, designed to keep its occupants compliant until they served their purpose. That purpose became terrifyingly clear on a brutal February night when Mercy collapsed in pain weeks before her due date. The storm howled against the walls, and Rosemont's true nature closed in around them. As Mercy's labor tore through her body, the sisters were led not to the comfort of their chambers, but to a place neither had ever seen: a cold, whitewashed room in the east wing of Rosemont, stripped of warmth and decorated only with instruments of steel. It looked less like a bedroom than a ward, a space built for procedure rather than care. Dr. Fletcher arrived with unsettling speed, flanked by two men whose faces were unfamiliar and whose roles were never explained. They carried themselves like professionals, yet never spoke of medicine, only of protocols. Charity, banished to a smaller adjoining room, sat in helpless torment as her sister's cries filled the air. Pressing her ear to the thin wall, she caught fragments of conversation not meant for her ears. "The specimen appears to be developing normally," one voice noted. "No obvious defects or abnormalities. The mother's condition is sufficient for delivery, but will follow the usual protocol afterward." Another chimed in. "Mr. Witt has been very clear about the schedule. Transport arrangements are in place. Wilmington expects delivery within the week." Charity's heart froze. They weren't talking about Mercy and her baby as people. They were speaking of them as stock to be processed products for shipment. And then, as night bled into dawn, Mercy's cries ceased with a jarring finality. The silence pressed so heavily that Charity thought her own breath might stop. Moments later, Dr. Fletcher emerged, blood on his hands, his eyes avoiding hers. In clipped, rehearsed tones, he told her the baby was stillborn and that complications had claimed her sister's life. But Charity knew better. Just before that silence, she had heard Mercy calling her name, desperate, alive. Mercy hadn't slipped away peacefully. She had been silenced. The shock left Charity hollow, but not broken. She understood now that she was alone in the house with a man who had murdered her sister and stolen her child. And she herself was days away from giving birth. Escape was no longer the dream. It was survival. Whitlow staged a convincing display of grief, arranging a funeral that drew sympathetic neighbors. A coffin sealed tight was buried under a granite marker in Rosemont's family plot. Yet in the nights that followed, when the mourners had gone, Charity heard things that defied the lie carved in stone: muffled footsteps from the cellar, voices whispering in the dark, and worst of all, the cry of a newborn, echoing faintly through the mansion's foundations. Her sister's child was alive, and perhaps Mercy too. The horror deepened with every visit from Dr. Fletcher, who no longer treated her like a patient, but like breeding stock. His clinical notes were spoken as if she were not even present. "The subject is responding well. Pregnancy unaffected. Expect normal delivery within the week." Whitlow's response was chilling in its detachment. "And the arrangements confirmed," Fletcher replied. Charleston has a buyer particularly interested due to the twin genetics. They're offering a premium. Excellent, Whitlow said smoothly. And the other matter, the facility in Wilmington is prepared for long-term housing. The previous subject has adjusted, and the infant has been successfully placed with the family in Virginia. The words cut through her like knives. Wilmington, housing, placement. Mercy was alive, caged somewhere beyond Rosemont, while her baby had already been sold like livestock. And now Charity understood the full horror. Her unborn child was next a prize in a market she hadn't known existed. With her delivery approaching, she had no choice left but to act. Her survival and her child's would depend on a desperate, dangerous plan. If escape was impossible before her child came, then Charity would need to turn Rosemont itself into a crime scene the outside world could not ignore. She knew proof was her only weapon. In the nights that followed, she used the secret passages of the mansion like arteries slipping through its hollow veins with a candle stub and a racing heart. In Whitlow's study, hidden beneath layers of locked drawers and false backs, she found what she needed. The ledger was written in neat, almost mechanical script, and though coded, its meaning was unmistakable. Specimen MC, delivered February 1832. Subject Wilmington product, Richmond payment $800. Specimen SH, delivered March 1833. Subject Charleston product, Savannah payment $950. Year after year, name after name, mothers marked as specimens, children sold as products, and money changing hands. The entries grew bolder over time, payments climbing higher, as if each life destroyed only sharpened the machine that consumed them. Behind another false panel lay letters written in the elegant hand of a men who never expected their words to be read outside their circle. Some spoke of placements in wealthy households, children sold to desperate families who believed themselves saviors. Others hinted at darker purposes where girls were described in terms of conditioning and suitability. The most recent letter made her blood run cold. Jeremiah Charleston buyer has requested twin stock if available. Premium payment $2,000 for matched pair in good condition. Richmond contact interested in breeding potential of identical genetics. Advised timeline for next delivery HM. The stationery bore the crest of Southern Maritime Trading of Wilmington. Whitlow was not merely a monster in isolation. He was a cog in a vast network, a trade in human flesh that spanned the coast. Clutching a small camera she had discovered in the cellar, abandoned by one of the vanished women, Charity photographed everything. She had barely replaced the papers when footsteps in the hall forced her to retreat into the walls, heart hammering as she fled to her room. The next morning, she gambled everything on one move. When Dr. Fletcher came for his daily visit, she did not cower. She fixed him with a gaze that made his hands shake worse than ever. "I know," she whispered. "I know about Wilmington, about Charleston, about Virginia. And I know my sister is alive." His face drained of color. He glanced at the door, then leaned close, voice cracking in a hurried whisper. "You don't understand. I never meant Whitlow has leverage. Years ago, I botched a surgery. A patient died because of me. He covered it up. He has the records, the witnesses. If I disobey him, I lose everything, my license, my family's name. He owns me." For the first time, Charity saw not a predator, but another prisoner. Fletcher was not innocent, but he was desperate, and desperation could be turned into alliance. Before she could press further, Whitlow's tread echoed in the hall. The doctor straightened instantly, resuming his mask of clinical detachment. But as he gathered his tools, he bent close one last time and whispered a single word that jolted her blood. "Tonight." Hours later, as the house settled into its eerie silence, Charity lay feigning sleep. She heard the hinges of the front door groan. Fletcher had returned. But this time, instead of his physician's satchel, he carried something heavier wrapped in cloth. A tool not of medicine, but of defiance. The pistol at Fletcher's hip, the lantern in his grip, and the coil of rope slung over his shoulder were no longer props of uncertainty. They were the tools of a man who had chosen a side. Whether that side was hers or Whitlow's, Charity could not yet tell. As she lay on the bed, heart hammering, she listened to the voices carrying through Rosemont's cavernous halls. Whitlow's tone was clipped and controlled. Fletcher's low and anxious, and a third voice, deep, harsh, foreign to Carolina gentility, spoke with the bluntness of someone used to command. "The timeline has been moved up," Whitlow said, every word measured. "We complete the transfer tonight." Fletcher's protest was immediate, his voice shaking. "She isn't due for 4 more days. Inducing now could compromise the child." "The product's value is irrelevant," the stranger cut in, his accent flattening the vowels. "Security comes first. Fayetteville's asking questions. We leave nothing to chance." Charity's pulse surged. Someone in town had noticed. The net around Whitlow's empire was beginning to tighten, and she was about to become collateral damage in its unraveling. Footsteps drew closer, the sound of boots on polished wood. Her door creaked open, and in the sliver of lamplight, she saw them. Whitlow's cold eyes gleaming, Fletcher's trembling hands, and the hulking shadow of the stranger looming behind. "The sedative will act in minutes," Fletcher murmured, voice barely steady. "But for the record, I'm being coerced." "This violates every principle. Spare me your conscience," Whitlow snapped. "Do it." Fletcher stepped forward, syringe in hand. And then Charity acted. She bolted upright, her voice sharp and urgent, pitched to echo through the halls of Rosemont. "Dr. Fletcher, I think it's happening now. The baby is coming." The words shattered their composure. Fletcher dropped the syringe glass, splintering across the floor. Whitlow's mask slipped, fury flashing across his aristocratic facade. The stranger's hand darted inside his coat, but froze when Charity let out a cry of feigned agony, clutching her belly as though gripped by contractions. Fletcher bent quickly to examine her, his training instinctively overriding fear. "The contractions are real, regular, strong. We may not need to induce." He looked up, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But Charity knew the truth. She had staged this moment, timing false contractions all night, until she was certain she could play her part. The trap had been sprung, but not by Whitlow. As they scrambled to prepare for delivery, Charity's gaze caught something beyond the window. Lanterns, more than one, bobbing along the main road, their glow cutting through the pre-dawn dark. The rhythmic march of torches. A party was coming. Whitlow followed her gaze. For the first time, color drained from his face. "How long?" he hissed. The stranger pulled the curtain aside, scanning the road. "Half an hour. Maybe less. Looks like the sheriff and his men." The fragile clockwork of Whitlow's empire was seconds from shattering, and with her unborn child still inside her, Charity knew she stood at the knife's edge between rescue and ruin. The moment Mrs. Donovan confessed, the room seemed to freeze. For years she had played the obedient servant, nodding, trembling, never daring to defy Whitlow. But now her shoulders straightened, her watery eyes blazed, and her voice carried the weight of truth. "It was me," she repeated louder this time, her hands no longer wringing, but clenched into fists. "I could not let another child vanish into your hell. Not while I still had breath in my body." Whitlow's carefully groomed mask cracked entirely, fury contorting his face into something savage. "You treacherous hag," he spat, lunging toward her. But the thunder of fists on Rosemont's front doors stopped him cold. Open in the name of the law came the booming order, followed by the sound of rifles being readied. Lantern light bled through the cracks of the shutters, casting jagged bars of gold across the tense scene. The stranger by the window cursed again and raised his weapon, his broad shoulders blocking out the faint glow. "We can fight our way out," he growled. 6, maybe 8 of them. "We've handled worse." But even as he spoke, the shouts outside multiplied, more voices, more horses. This was no small posse. The weight of federal authority pressed against Rosemont's grand doors. Dr. Fletcher's hands shook so violently, he dropped his forceps, the clatter ringing through the chamber like a bell tolling doom. "It's over," he whispered, half to himself, half to Charity. "It's finally over." Whitlow whirled on him, pale eyes burning with betrayal. "No, it is not over until I say it is." He snatched the pistol from Fletcher's coat, brandishing it with a hand that remained steady despite the chaos unraveling around him. His gaze flicked to Charity, belly taut with the child he had called his perfect product, and his lips twisted into a cruel smile. "If they take me, they'll find nothing but a grieving widower and a corpse. Your corpse." But before he could act, Mrs. Donovan, trembling with both terror and resolve, hurled the lantern she had been holding toward him. The glass shattered at his feet, flames leaping across the Persian rug with startling speed. Whitlow stumbled back, his fine coat catching sparks as the stranger swore and stamped at the fire. The front doors exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood. Lanterns and rifles flooded into Rosemont's grand hall as the sheriff's party and the marshals stormed inside, their boots pounding like drums of judgment. Shouts echoed through the mansion. U.S. Marshals, drop your weapons. For the first time, Charity saw fear flicker across Whitlow's pale eyes. Not the fear of law, but of exposure, the collapse of the empire he had built in shadows. His entire operation, perfected for 8 years, was unraveling in a single night of fire, betrayal, and justice. And as the chaos roared around her, Charity clutched her swollen belly and prayed that the child she carried would never know the darkness that had haunted Rosemont. The law's arrival shattered Rosemont's illusion of grandeur and stripped Whitlow of the composure he had so carefully crafted for nearly a decade. As the marshals fanned through the halls and deputies pried open hidden panels, the secrets that had festered in the dark were dragged into the light. His empire of silence collapsed in a single night. Sheriff Crawford's words hit harder than any blow. We have testimony from survivors. For Charity, those words were almost too much to believe. Mercy alive, perhaps others too? The hope ignited in her chest, even as her body convulsed with the pain of labor. Dr. Fletcher's confession only tightened the noose around Whitlow's neck. His trembling voice laid bare what investigators needed to bring down not just the man, but the entire network. His testimony mapped the arteries of the Operation Coastal Cities. Warehouses, buyers disguised as benefactors, officials bribed to file false death certificates. It revealed a system as cold and calculated as any business empire. But unlike Whitlow, Fletcher spoke not with arrogance, but with the broken cadence of a man desperate for penance. The investigators wasted no time. Rosemont was stripped room by room, its grandeur reduced to evidence tags and photographs. The cellar became the centerpiece of the case, its walls still etched with the fingernail-scratched names of women whose fates had long been whispered but never proven. From there, the trail stretched outward to ledgers, letters, and shipments that exposed a human trafficking network sprawling across 4 states. Babies cataloged as products, women reduced to specimens, profits soaring year by year. The full weight of its depravity was almost too much for the lawmen themselves to stomach. The Wilmington raid was the final damning proof. In a warehouse thick with the stench of neglect, marshals found 12 women alive, their bodies frail, their spirits fractured, but their survival undeniable. Among them was Mercy Goodwin. When she was brought to Fayetteville's hospital, her reunion with Charity was so raw, it silenced even the hardened deputies standing guard. Each believed the other dead. Each had endured her captivity under the lie that her sister had not survived. The cruelty of that manipulation, the stripping away of hope itself, was as vile as any physical abuse they had suffered. Charity, weakened but alive, after delivering her son, clutched Mercy's hands with a desperation that only blood and trauma could forge. Mercy trembled, her voice hollow, as she revealed the psychological warfare of Rosemont and Wilmington. "They told us our loved ones were gone," she whispered. "That we had no reason to fight. That our babies were dead. And some of us believed them." Whitlow's methods were chilling in their precision. He posed as a model of refinement while buying the silence of officials, forging records, and cultivating respectability. His victims were erased with pen strokes, deaths attributed to fevered childbirth or unnamed ailments. Their children vanished into the parlors of wealthy families who believed they were adopting orphans. His wealth was laundered into tobacco, cotton, and railroads, blending monstrous profits into the fabric of legitimate Southern prosperity. But with survivors testifying with ledgers and letters in federal hands, the network's days were numbered. Rosemont, once a mansion of opulence, stood hollow and charred at its edges, a crime scene where perfection had masked rot. Whitlow's downfall became a spectacle unlike anything the region had ever seen. For nearly a decade, he had cloaked himself in respectability, an influential businessman, a patron of industry, a man whose refinement and wealth shielded him from suspicion. But once the cellar at Rosemont was opened and the Wilmington warehouse exposed, the truth was undeniable. Women had been treated as breeding stock, their children bartered like livestock. Survivors described years of torment, confinement, forced pregnancies, medical experiments that left scars both physical and mental. Those who resisted paid with broken bodies, some with their lives. The scope of the network staggered even hardened federal marshals. Facilities in Charleston, Norfolk, and Savannah revealed that Whitlow's enterprise was not a local corruption, but a multi-state industry generating profits that rivaled legitimate plantations and trading companies. Over $50,000 had changed hands, wealth that in today's value reached into the millions, all earned through the sale of stolen lives. The buyers list read like the social registry of the South, exposing the rot at the heart of respectable society. Families who believed they had adopted orphans now faced the horror of realizing they had purchased stolen children. Others, whose motives were far darker, stood exposed for what they truly were. The trial transfixed the nation. Courtrooms overflowed, newspapers carried daily accounts, and every revelation of corruption sent shockwaves through polite society. Prominent citizens in multiple states were arrested. Judges, sheriffs, and doctors who had falsified records or turned a blind eye were stripped of their offices and sent to prison. Buyers who had knowingly participated faced prosecution, their fortunes and reputations destroyed. Dr. Fletcher, whose trembling testimony laid bare the entire machinery, secured a reduced sentence but would never escape the shadow of his complicity. His confessions of surgical mistakes, blackmail, and cowardice made him a tragic figure condemned to live with the memory of women and children lost under his watch. Mrs. Donovan, the housekeeper whose courage cracked Whitlow's empire, became the unsung hero of the case. Her simple act of defiance, sending word to her nephew at the courthouse, had set the chain of justice in motion. Without her, the sisters and countless others would have vanished forever. Federal investigators credited her as the linchpin that saved lives and exposed the operation. On December 15, 1840, Jeremiah Whitlow stood on the gallows, still insisting on his innocence. He claimed his work was misunderstood, that he had been pursuing human perfection through selective breeding. His cold arrogance only fueled the fury of those who came to see him hang. Families of victims traveled for days to witness his execution. Among the crowd stood Mercy and Charity Goodwin, who had endured months of testimony, interrogations, and reliving their trauma to bring him down. When the trapdoor opened and Whitlow's final words were cut short, a chapter of horror closed, but the scars he left would endure. The Goodwin sisters were transformed from victims into symbols of resilience. Newspapers across the nation carried their story, warning women of the dangers of predatory men who cloaked evil in refinement. Charity, who had nearly lost her life in childbirth under Whitlow's roof, named her son Thomas after Sheriff Crawford, the man who had led the raid. That boy grew into a lawyer dedicated to fighting crimes against women and children, determined to ensure predators like Whitlow never again operated unchecked. Mercy, though deeply scarred, found strength in faith. She married a kind minister from Fayetteville and poured herself into helping other survivors. With the aid of federal investigators, her daughter was recovered from a Virginia household and returned to her arms, a moment of grace after so much stolen hope. Together, the sisters lived as living proof that even in the darkest corners of society, truth could be uncovered, justice could prevail, and survival itself could become a weapon against evil. Their courage did not erase the horrors of Rosemont, but it ensured that the memory of those who vanished would not be buried in silence. Whitlow's downfall became a spectacle unlike anything the region had ever seen. For nearly a decade, he had cloaked himself in respectability, an influential businessman, a patron of industry, a man whose refinement and wealth shielded him from suspicion. But once the cellar at Rosemont was opened and the Wilmington warehouse exposed, the truth was undeniable. Women had been treated as breeding stock, their children bartered like livestock. Survivors described years of torment, confinement, forced pregnancies, medical experiments that left scars both physical and mental. Those who resisted paid with broken bodies, some with their lives. The scope of the network staggered even hardened federal marshals. Facilities in Charleston, Norfolk, and Savannah revealed that Whitlow's enterprise was not a local corruption, but a multi-state industry generating profits that rivaled legitimate plantations and trading companies. Over $50,000 had changed hands, wealth that in today's value reached into the millions, all earned through the sale of stolen lives. The buyers list read like the social registry of the South, exposing the rot at the heart of respectable society. Families who believed they had adopted orphans now faced the horror of realizing they had purchased stolen children. Others whose motives were far darker stood exposed for what they truly were. The trial transfixed the nation. Courtrooms overflowed, newspapers carried daily accounts, and every revelation of corruption sent shockwaves through polite society. Prominent citizens in multiple states were arrested. Judges, sheriffs, and doctors who had falsified records or turned a blind eye were stripped of their offices and sent to prison. Buyers who had knowingly participated faced prosecution, their fortunes and reputations destroyed. Dr. Fletcher, whose trembling testimony laid bare the entire machinery, secured a reduced sentence, but would never escape the shadow of his complicity. His confessions of surgical mistakes, blackmail, and cowardice made him a tragic figure condemned to live with the memory of women and children lost under his watch. Mrs. Donovan, the housekeeper whose courage cracked Whitlow's empire, became the unsung hero of the case. Her simple act of defiance, sending word to her nephew at the courthouse, had set the chain of justice in motion. Without her, the sisters and countless others would have vanished forever. Federal investigators credited her as the linchpin that saved lives and exposed the operation. On December 15, 1840, Jeremiah Whitlow stood on the gallows, still insisting on his innocence. He claimed his work was misunderstood, that he had been pursuing human perfection through selective breeding. His cold arrogance only fueled the fury of those who came to see him hang. Families of victims traveled for days to witness his execution. Among the crowd stood Mercy and Charity Goodwin, who had endured months of testimony interrogations and reliving their trauma to bring him down. When the trap door opened and Whitlow's final words were cut short, a chapter of horror closed. But the scars he left would endure. The Goodwin sisters were transformed from victims into symbols of resilience. Newspapers across the nation carried their story warning women of the dangers of predatory men who cloaked evil in refinement. Charity, who had nearly lost her life in childbirth under Whitlow's roof, named her son Thomas after Sheriff Crawford, the man who had led the raid. That boy grew into a lawyer dedicated to fighting crimes against women and children, determined to ensure predators like Whitlow never again operated unchecked. Mercy, though deeply scarred, found strength in faith. She married a kind minister from Fayetteville and poured herself into helping other survivors. With the aid of federal investigators, her daughter was recovered from a Virginia household and returned to her arms, a moment of grace after so much stolen hope. Together, the sisters lived as living proof that even in the darkest corners of society, truth could be uncovered, justice could prevail, and survival itself could become a weapon against evil. Their courage did not erase the horrors of Rosemont, but it ensured that the memory of those who vanished would not be buried in silence. This is a chilling, powerful, and well-rounded conclusion to the saga of Rosemont and Jeremiah Whitlow. You've carried the narrative full circle from mystery to revelation to justice and finally to legacy. The way you close by showing the long-term consequences both for individuals and for society gives the story a sense of weight and authenticity that lingers long after the telling. What works especially well here? Consequences across levels. You don't just stop at Whitlow's execution, you follow through with the fate of Fletcher, Mrs. Donovan, Mercy, and Charity, as well as the broader societal reforms sparked by the case. That makes the narrative feel bigger than one villain showing systemic failure and systemic change. Legacy and memory. The sealing of the records until 1890 adds a haunting historical realism, while Charity's reflection later in life ties the horror back to the fragile hope of survival. Call to reflection. By asking the audience whether they believe all of Whitlow's network was truly exposed, you invite them into the story, keeping it alive beyond the narrative itself. If you want to elevate it even further, for a documentary-style YouTube script, you might consider tightening the final paragraph into something that feels like a voiceover, fading into black. For example, ending not just on the reminder of justice, but on a haunting note about what might still remain hidden, inviting viewers to sit with that unease.